Hello, everybody. As we're letting people in from the waiting room, can you let us know in the chat where you are joining us from? And we're just going to get started in a minute or two to let people in from the waiting room and get situated.
We have people from Edmonton. Well, we have people from all over Alberta,
Yeah.
Quebec, Vancouver, Tennessee, Ontario. Oh, Nigeria. Amazing. People all over the world here today. Japan.
Wow.
Hi, everybody. New Brunswick.
Very cool. Lots of fellow Canadians here and exciting to see people from all over as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Awesome. So it looks like we have quite a few people in from the waiting room now. So as people come in, they'll have to just join us as they come. But yeah, thank you guys so much for joining us today. We are going to be talking about becoming a therapist as a social worker. And even if you don't have experience, how you can start developing your skills to get into therapy. So you might be a social worker, a social work student, or someone who's considering a degree in social work to become a therapist. The problem is that while many therapists and counselors have a background in social work, there isn't always a clear path to getting there. So today we're hoping to have a conversation with you about what you can start doing now to start building the skills needed to become a therapist as a social worker. So, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Michelle, and I'm the founder of MSW Helper. MSW Helper is a platform designed to help you apply to Master of Social Work programs with confidence. I started MSW Helper after going through the process of applying to MSW programs and realizing how little information there was about the process. I had questions that I couldn't find the answers for, and I found the process of applying to social work programs to be quite overwhelming. So, we are here to help you get the answers that you're looking for and provide support with the application process. And one thing that I am noticing is that many of you are pursuing an MSW in order to become a therapist. And that's why I am very excited to introduce you to Kayla Das, who is a business coach for therapists and counselors. She helps people who want to get into private practice. I've brought her here because I have been hearing from those of you who want to become a therapist, but you're not quite sure how to get there. So, my hope is that you walk away with some clear ideas and next steps for building your skill sets. So, I'm going to give Kayla a minute to introduce herself as well.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Michelle, for the lovely introduction. So, as Michelle stated, I am a social worker, business coach, podcast host, and author, and soon to be author again. I'm also the owner of the Canadian Clinical Supervision Therapist Directory and the soon to be American Clinical Supervisor Therapist Directory. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on as well. I'm currently registered in both Alberta and Ontario. Also, Michelle will be giving a disclaimer later on. A lot of my um, content today will be specifically about these two provinces, although we have people across Canada. And like a lot of this applies, the same with across the world. But we're going to be giving specific examples from these two provinces because those are the ones that I am most familiar with. And of course, being a registered social worker myself, I would be able to provide more insight about. I currently live in Alberta, Canada, but I do have a little bit of an accent. I'm actually from Newfoundland, Canada. I am currently a mom of a 21-year-old and a dog mom of two handsome little pups, Larry and Marshall, who are actually the stars of my first book, which is a children's book called Larry and Marshall's Newfoundland Adventures. So while this is my first book, we'll also be talking about um, a book that's relevant to therapists in the future, but I just wanted to kind of highlight them too because they are really the stars of my first book.
Awesome. Thank you, Kayla. I think you guys are in for a treat. Kayla has lots of knowledge to share. And yeah, I'm really excited about what we're talking about today. So just a quick disclaimer. This presentation is informational and educational only. It should not be considered professional advice. So please be aware that the requirements and processes for becoming a therapist as a social worker can vary depending on your province, territory, or state, as each jurisdiction is governed by its own social work regulatory body and may have specific legislation regarding providing therapeutic services. Because Kayla is registered in Alberta and I'm registered in Ontario, most of the information shared in this presentation will reflect our knowledge and experiences within these regions. So we strongly encourage you to seek out information relevant to your own circumstances and jurisdiction, as requirements may differ. For any regulatory specific questions, please consult your own regulatory body for the most accurate and up-to-date advice. So as we saw in the chat, it seems like a lot of people in this call are located in Canada. So a lot of the information here is going to be relevant, but again, make sure that you are looking at your own regulatory body, and that should be your first source for information. Okay, so for those of you in this call, I'm sure a lot of you have a background in social work, or you are considering pursuing your degree in social work. I think one of the first things that's important to have a conversation about is whether a social work degree is the best path for you to become a therapist or a counselor. While social work is a really popular path to achieve that goal, there's quite a few options to get there. And I think it's important to have an understanding of what those options are and which one might be best for you based on your goals. So this is not a comprehensive list, but these are some of the options that are available to you if you have ambitions of becoming a therapist or counselor. So of course, we have a degree in social work. So that would be a Master of Social Work or a Bachelor of Social Work degree. There's also degrees like counseling psychology, psychotherapy, marriage and family therapy, and creative arts therapies. So like music therapy and art therapy programs. Each of these pathways has different licensing pathways. So they lead to slightly different career paths that can perform the act of therapy. So for social work degrees, you would be on a path to become a licensed or registered social worker. The language may differ depending on where you are. And then if you're considering a degree in counseling psychology, for example, that would put you on the path to become like a registered psychotherapist. So depending on where you are, the language for that is going to change. And it's important to know the distinction between what these different pathways can lead you to. So let's talk about the Master of Social Work. I think this is an important place to start because I know that a lot of you here are considering Master of Social Work programs. So a Master of Social Work is a great option if you want to provide therapy while also keeping your career options open. The really nice thing about social work is that it gives you the credential to pursue counseling and therapy in different capacities, but it also opens the door for you to be a social worker. So if you are someone who like maybe has interests in exploring therapy and counseling and going down that path, maybe have an interest in private practice, but you don't want to, you don't want to keep your options narrow, so a social work degree might be a really good fit for you. However, the challenge with this pathway is that the road to actually becoming a therapist or counselor might not be as clear compared to other programs. One challenge I do find is that for some people, it can be hard to like break into therapy after graduation. Oftentimes, you don't get a ton of training or courses that are specific to providing therapy and like therapeutic modalities. And so, oftentimes, you have to get creative about how you're going to develop the skill sets to, be someone who can provide those services. That's something that we are going to talk about a bit more is how you can get creative and how you can map out a game plan for breaking into therapy with a social work degree. On the other hand, there are other educational pathways that can also help you become like a therapist or counselor. So, for example, I see a lot of people pursue programs like a master's in counseling psychology. The nice thing about a program like counseling psychology is that the courses are much more designed for somebody who really wants to get into therapy and counseling. So you're going to learn more about like therapeutic modalities and how like the clinical skills that you need to provide therapy after graduation. In addition to that, your internships and other learning opportunities will probably be clinical in focus. And so you're going to graduate with more education in therapy and counseling, as well as practical experience. However, on the flip side, they might not, these types of programs might not lead to as many career options compared to a social work degree. So I think it's really important to consider what your career goals are when you are choosing graduate school programs. It says MSW programs, it should say graduate programs. So you want to make sure that you are like really thinking about what do you see yourself doing post-graduation and what options do you want to have available to you? Later today, I'm going to send you a follow-up email and I'm going to invite you to have a conversation with me if you are considering different programs and want some advice about, which path might make the most sense for your career goals. Okay, so for those of you who are on the pathway of choosing social work programs, I think it's really important to know that there are MSW programs that have a clinical focus, meaning they put special attention into like courses and things that will help you become a therapist or counselor after graduation. And those can be extremely helpful because it can help you to bridge that like skill gap that you may have otherwise if you choose another program. However, it's important to know that clinically focused MSW programs are not a requirement to become a therapist or a counselor with a social work degree. I always say that an MSW is an MSW. Whether you specialize in one thing or keep it more generalist, at the end of the day, the credential is the same and you have the same doors open to you. And then Kayla is going to talk a little bit about becoming a therapist with a BSW and talking a little bit about credentials as well.
So, I know that many of you had actually asked, can I be a therapist with a BSW? And the answer is sometimes. And it really does depend on your regulatory college's standards and regulations. But in some jurisdictions, yes, you can. And I'm going to give some examples in a little bit. But I do want to highlight that regulatory requirements can change at any time. Regulatory bodies across, again, provinces, across states, across the world require different things from their social workers. In addition, there's legislation by the government that often gets imposed at different times that may change or kind of dictate who may practice psychotherapy or therapy in a specific area. And we're going to talk again about some examples. Here in Canada, for example, in Ontario and Alberta, there's no distinction between educational degrees for providing in-scope or unrestricted counseling services. And we're going to talk a little bit about restricted versus unrestricted kind of therapy services. And again, this also varies province to province. In addition, currently here in Canada, the Yukon social work practice isn't even regulated at this point, although they are looking into it. They're hoping to get regulated in the future, which means basically anyone could call themselves a social worker in the Yukon at this point in time, whether they have a social work degree or not. So when something is unregulated, it means that, there isn't a regulation, there isn't a regulatory body kind of determining who can practice, what education is required, and so forth. Uh, I know there's going to be some questions of, I'm in this province. Does that mean I can practice with the BSW? This is where I encourage you to, again, consult with your regulatory body. While some regulatory bodies will say yes or no from you can have a BSW, can't have a BSW, sometimes it's about in what's not said versus what is said. And I am going to give you some examples because I'm sure there's people from Alberta and Ontario like, I did not know this. And it's because the language is meant to be um like for us to have kind of critical analysis because some people with a BSW may have the training skills and knowledge, and again we're going to talk about that in a little bit, to practice therapy, while someone even with an MSW may not have the skills knowledge to practice therapy. So we're going to talk about the pathway of becoming a therapist. That's today, but I do want to highlight that with a BSW in certain provinces, you can become a therapist if you kind of follow that pathway. And so this is where I'm going to give you some examples to prove that like this is true. So the Ontario College of Social Workers and Social Services Workers just actually this year had created a letter to insurance companies because what they've noticed, which many of us social workers in therapy also notice, that many insurance companies are not providing um, like the health insurances are not covering Bachelor of Social Work services in Ontario. So I'm just going to read this out, but this explicitly states the Ontario College of Social Workers and Social Services Workers position. And again, this is a letter to insurance companies. We have also received reports from registrants who have had claims denied because they do not have a Master's of Social Work degree. Although they do have a bachelor Although they do have a Bachelor of Social Work or a Diploma of Social Service Worker and are registered with the Ontario College of Social Workers, Social Services Workers, um, the Ontario College of Social Workers and Social Services Workers makes no distinction for registration between these educational qualifications. And I got this highlighted. Registrants who do not have a Master's of Social Work degree are allowed to practice the controlled act of psychotherapy in Ontario. In addition, I do want to highlight the difference between being a therapist and being a therapist in private practice. So there's being a therapist, working in an agency, being an employee, also being under, like the supervision of an individual within, that organization. However, even though the Ontario College of Social Workers and Social Services Workers do not create a distinction between who can provide the controlled act of psychotherapy in Ontario, they do request that, well, they do state the private practice is not an entry to practice competency, meaning that, coming out of social work, they do not recommend that you independently start practicing without having some experience kind of under your belt. So I think that that's also important. It doesn't mean that with a BSW you can't provide therapy, but they do recommend that, private practice is not an entry level competency. So let's talk a little bit about the Alberta College of Social Workers private practice guidelines. So I'm going to read this out. So this is kind of based on so I should explain that as of September of this year, the Alberta College of Social Workers have created a new private practice guidelines, which I think is honestly an amazing document. I think they did really, really well in kind of highlighting private practice as a whole and kind of what needs to be considered and thought about when creating a private practice. But these are some quotes from that document. Social workers must meet the requirements for registration on the general registry and then reflect and evaluate whether private practice is a good fit. So, for people here in Alberta, we have kind of registries, which isn't the same in Ontario. So, there's the provisional registry, the general registry, and then the clinical registry. So, basically, this is saying if you're still a provisional social worker in Alberta, you know, it may not be appropriate to go into private practice at this point in time. However, when you gain the supervision required to become on the general registry, you can go into private practice. What sometimes people confuse is that you need to have be on the clinical registry, which is the RCSW designation. So registered social worker registered clinical social worker designation. That is not required to go into private practice as a therapist. Also, registrants must continually assess their knowledge, skill, and judgment, i.e., competence, to determine whether they are equipped to work with a particular client population, provide specific services, or interventions to engage in independent or private practice. So, the reason I'm highlighting this is a lot of the language in the Alberta College of Social Workers practice guidelines is ensuring that you have the skills, the knowledge, the training, the judgment to go into private practice. So while you can go in with a BSW, not everyone with a BSW may feel that it is um, at this point in time, that they have built those skills required. The same with someone with an MSW. So really the language here is to ensure that, you kind of self-assess and identify that you have these skills to be able to go into private practice. Because of course, in private practice, while we're going to talk about supervision in a little bit, like external supervision, you don't have that close supervision like you would if you were a therapist, say, in a health center, or like you have colleagues that you can consult and connect with. So that's a big portion of that there. And then, so also with the guidelines is post-secondary social work education provides a necessary foundation to begin practice in social work, but they also indicate that in and of itself is insufficient for registrants to be competent in all areas of private practice. So again, going back to it's not just about the education that you have, like the level of education. It's about like continuing that education in a specific area, which is therapeutic modalities. Also, we're going to talk about too the private practice business skills isn't necessarily taught in our trainings. So therapy skills and business skills are two very different skills. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit as well. Also, the competence is, so again, from the Alberta College of Social Workers, competence is acquired and maintained as a part of professional practice and throughout one's career. And they go in to say that consultation and supervision is super important in private practice, and I think really in any type of practice, not just in private practice. And I have noticed, so I just want to give a heads up that I know that there's questions popping up in the chat. We will have a Q&A at the end. Emily, which is one of our social work students, she is kind of keeping track of all these questions because the chances are we're probably still going to answer some of those questions as we keep going through. And then she will compile it to a list and we're going to have a Q&A at the end. So just know that I'm not ignoring your questions as they pop in. We'll just answer them at the end because chances are we'll still might answer some of these questions for you along the way.
Okay, so what it sounds like is, with a social work degree, you have the qualification to get into therapy and private practice, but you need to become competent in providing those services. And that brings us back to the problem and why you're probably here today is, how do you bridge that gap and start actually developing some of the skill sets to take that leap and get into therapy and counseling. So we're going to talk a little bit about some ways that you can start planting seeds and start developing some of those skills. So For those of you who are in an MSW program or even a BSW program, or who are applying to programs, it is a great idea to leverage your internships. As a social work student, you're going to have multiple placement experiences. So even if you don't choose a clinically focused program, you can try to get a clinically focused placement. And that's exactly what I did. I went to like a generalist MSW program, meaning there wasn't really like a specific specialization. And I remember we took one course on therapeutic modalities, and every week we focused on a different modality. So, what that means is, I had a 2 hour class on cognitive behavioral therapy, and that was my master's training in CBT. So, that's not really enough to go out and start practicing therapy. So, what I did is I identified with my um, like internship coordinator, the person who matches you to internships, that I did have interests in clinical social work and therapy. So through that, I was actually able to get an internship where I was doing therapy with clients, basically in a doctor's office that also provided like therapy services. That was a great way to actually get some experience that really helped me develop, put that I was able to put that on my resume, and that helped me get my first job out of graduation. I actually even got a job offer from that agency. So, I mean, that would have been a very natural bridge for me to continue on. I ended up taking another role, but there are definitely opportunities that come from your internship experiences. The other thing is, you can definitely develop skills via more traditional social work jobs. So many social workers may choose to work in more traditional social work roles before going into therapy and counseling roles. Focusing on roles that help you develop interpersonal practice skills. So things like active listening, critical thinking, de-escalation, and developing professional boundaries, amongst a whole lot of other skills, is a really great starting point. That gives you like the base skills on like working with people and navigating challenges and meeting people with where they're at and all those things. All of those skills are like very much needed in counseling roles as well. And then with that, you are likely going to want to supplement that with things like additional trainings on therapeutic modalities and, you know, just start like developing your skills that way.
Okay, and now we're going to talk a little bit about social work practicums. So sometimes we, think of our social work practicums as a way to complete the degree, but these are really great experiences to be able to help you with your future profession, whether you want to be a therapist or, any other type of social worker. In saying that, I also want to highlight that you know, potentially if you choose a practicum that doesn't align with, say, maybe therapy, becoming a therapist, like Michelle had mentioned, there are like other options or other ways to be able to, get that experience. But when you're completing your social work practicums, it really provides that direct clinical experience, especially if you want to become a therapist. So, kind of finding a practicum that fits within that therapy role, if that's what you want to do. What I love about it too is it integrates theory with practice. We learn a lot of theory in our social work programs, but we don't learn how to apply it all the time. So your practicum is a really great way that you can really think about what you're learning into your programs and then implementing it into practice. It also enhances your skill development. So you're learning skills, you're learning modalities, you're learning techniques that you may or may not have learned in your program. It also provides you an opportunity to work with different niches or populations. So in private practice, we talk a lot about quote unquote niches. And niches is basically a specific area of practice that you want to work in, like a specific population. let me give you an example. When I was working in private practice, I worked with workplace stress and burnout. That was my niche. I worked with that population. And typically, when we're actually working in as an employee in any agency, we're often kind of told what we're niched in, right? If you're working in a hospital, you're probably working on a specific ward or department. If you're working in a specific agency that focuses on working with a specific individual population, you kind of build those skills within that niche. So it gives you an opportunity to kind of see, what kind of populations do I like to work with? Also, I'm all about clinical supervision, and you get clinical supervision from a social worker practicing as a therapist. So you kind of get to integrate the ethical and standards of practice, codes of ethics and standards of practice from a social work lens through a therapist as well. So I really enjoy that part when you're working in social work practicums. After you complete your program, that's when it's to think about, what type of trainings or skills do you want to build upon? Going back to one of the quotes, I think it was from the Alberta College of Social Workers, that a program in itself, doesn't create the skills, knowledge, and judgment that's required to be in private practice or to be as a therapist. And almost always, well, even if you go through the clinical route, chances are you're going to want post-degree trainings that, really focus in an in-depth area like specific modalities. There's so many therapeutic modalities, and in many of our trainings, we kind of learn like surface level if we learn them at all, depending on which route you go and depending on which program you're in. But we don't necessarily kind of learn again all about the therapeutic modalities and then how to apply them in practice. So it is almost essential that you continue to have post-degree trainings in those modalities or therapeutic approaches that you want to learn. It helps you build those skills when you're working with clients. And a lot of times these post trainings also give you resources that you can actually work with clients with, like specific homework sheets or specific worksheets, which you don't always learn in our BSW, MSW programs. So, yeah. And usually, you can also use it towards your training credits that you need, like for registration or licensure. So for most social workers, and again, I'm saying most because I don't know every college, every regulatory body, but many of our regulatory bodies require us to have so many continuing education credits every year. Usually you can use these towards those. And I say usually because again, every regulatory body has its own requirements, but that's also a bonus in taking these post training opportunities. So some examples of continuing education trainings is, having them directly from the institutes that create the therapeutic modality, like the Gottman Institute, EMDRIA, organizations like that that are, specifically created for a specific modality. You could also take university continuing education courses. I know Wilfrid Laurier offers a vast variety of different therapeutic modality trainings that you can take, post MSW, I think post BSW as well. Um, Online therapy training companies like PESI, Leading Edge Seminars, there's lots of different organizations out there. Webinars, the Canadian Association of Social Workers. Chances are when you're in an association here in Canada, a social work association, you'll get enrollment kind of in the CASW, and they have lots of webinars, trainings, people coming in. And also there's a variety of other therapists who have built their skills in specific modalities, and they also provide trainings as well. So this is what I love to really talk about is clinical supervision and consultation. While training should always be essential, right? We need those skills, we need that knowledge. It should always be supplemented by clinical supervision and consultation. While many regulatory bodies require supervision, supervision can also be an invaluable part of the learning as a therapist, as it connects theory to practice in ways education alone couldn't possibly do. And I did see a question pop in, so I'll kind of answer it now because it's relevant. Is, do I need, am I required to have clinical supervision? Now, that depends on a regulatory body. So as you can see, I'm always saying that because every regulatory body is different. It also depends on where you are in that process. And I'm going to use Alberta College of Social Workers, for example, because of course I'm here in Alberta. When you're on the provisional registry, you are required to take clinical supervision. You need so many direct practice hours, you need so many clinical supervision hours before you can get on the general registry list. So in that case, yes, you're absolutely required because you're not going to be able to go to the next level without it. Similar in Alberta, if you wanted to become an RCSW, so a registered clinical social worker, you are required to take so many clinical supervision hours under the supervision of, I want to say an RCSW, but there could be like other designations too. I'm not quite sure, but you do need a specific number of clinical supervision hours for your RCSW training. Now you might think, okay, well, what about the people on the general registry? And this is where like clinical supervision and consultation are often used interchangeably, but clinical supervision is often used for unlicensed or pre-licensed individual, and clinical consultation is for kind of that consultation you receive when you're not necessarily I guess, requiring a certain amount of hours. But it's still absolutely essential. Like, I truly, truly believe that we should, it doesn't matter how many years of practice you've been in, we should all be having either clinical supervision or consultation because that is how we. Really support our growth, our learning, and learn from others. And I saw it pop in, does peer consultations count? And I think it depends on your regulatory body if you're looking for the actual supervision part. I can't answer that question. If it's consultation, possibly, right? Because you're doing it for ongoing learning, support, and so forth. But the one challenge with peer supervision is it may or may not be a seasoned practitioner. So someone who, has had the experience, has the knowledge. It's, if everyone, has the exact same, like let's just hypothetically say everyone just came out of a BSW or MSW program, um, and there's no one with 5, 10 years experience, they may not necessarily have the skills, knowledge, or information to be able to help you with that problem or situation that arises. Similar, if you are someone who is the 5, 10, 20 year uh, person with all that training and you're in a group and you personally don't have anybody that's more seasoned than you, yours like what the advice that you need from practice may not necessarily translate. So I'm not saying that it's not valuable. I think peer consultation is very valuable, but I think it's balancing that I don't think it should replace um, clinical supervision or consultation from a seasoned professional. Now, whether that's group supervision, dyadic, individual, we're going to talk about that in a second. But I think that there's a time and a place for kind of both, if that makes sense. So we're actually going to talk about the different type of supervisors. So I kind of touched on this. So there's administrative supervisors, and administrative supervisors are people who, if we're working as a therapist in an agency or a social worker in an agency, it's an individual who manages your work schedule and tasks, i.e., your boss, right? Sometimes in some agencies, especially in like healthcare settings, you might have an administrative supervisor who's also your clinical supervisor. I mean, it could be both, but for the most part, if they're managing your work, your schedule, they're your boss. Now, it doesn't mean they're not going to help you with clinical aspects. It also doesn't mean that a clinical supervisor isn't going to help you, even in private practice, like manage your schedule, things like that, if that's something you're asking them for advice or support on. But at the end of the day, if we're just gonna really make it easy to understand, administrative supervisors are the people that manage your work schedules and tasks. A clinical supervisor is an experienced practitioner who provides clinical direction, advice, and mentorship to an unregistered or pre-registered or licensed or pre-licensed practitioner. So this is when you're working towards hours for something, whether it's you're on the provisional registry. This might also include if someone's on probation for any reason from a regulatory body. That would be clinical supervision because you're working towards a specific number of hours. A clinical consultant is an experienced practitioner who provides clinical advice or support to registered or licensed practitioners. Now, I want to also identify the difference in, I'm going to say, and again, I'm not a lawyer. I don't want to speak as if I am, but clinical supervisors tend to have more um, liability than consultants. And this is really important for you to know that when someone, if someone is supervising you so that you can go to the general registry, for instance, from the provisional registry, the clinical supervisor is taking kind of a risk in a sense when you are under their supervision. So there is some liability on the clinical supervisor, if something happens. So that's really important because I know I often hear kind of in Facebook groups and things like that, people are wondering, how much can their clinical supervisor tell them and how much do they actually have to follow what their clinical supervisor says. And at the end of the day, the clinical supervisor, is basically like helping train an unregistered, so if it's like a student or so forth, or a pre-registered, so someone on the provisional registry, they are taking their responsibility. However, with a clinical consultant, like if you are on the general registry, you've passed your schooling, you're fully licensed, there's no reason why you can't practice, then a consultant usually in their paperwork will have that they are not liable for any concerns that tends to happen. And it's because while you're seeking support from these individuals, you have the right to say no or yes, take what they say and kind of leave what they don't, or leave what you don't necessarily want to take. And it's because you're kind of asking for advice or support or guidance with a specific issue, but at the end of the day, you're the one that makes that decision. And I hope that that makes sense because I know, especially across Canada, we often use clinical supervisor, clinical consultant, uh, kind of as the same term, but if this is kind of what it means, if that makes sense. And then there's also types of clinical supervisors. So there's an internal clinical supervisor and an external clinical supervisor. So a clinical supervisor, or sorry, internal clinical supervisor is a supervisor who works in the same agency as you and provides clinical supervision as a part of their role. So chances are you're not really paying this individual for anything because they work in an agency. So let's just use a health center, for example. You're an employee, they're providing clinical supervision on cases within that agency. External clinical supervision is a clinical supervisor who works externally from you, usually in their own private practice or kind of has like a side clinical supervisor practice, and provides clinical supervision to you on a fee per session basis. And when you're in private practice, so this is really important if you're thinking about private practice, is that when it comes to like you're not going to have an internal clinical supervisor. So it's very likely that you will need to pay or consultant, supervisor, consultant. Even I'm mixing up the terms. But you would likely need to pay per session for any supervision services or consultation services. And that's because there isn't anyone internal. So I hope that that also makes some sense as well. And I did see one question come in, so I'm just going to just pop up. Um, so the question is, so would you suggest that for liability, if we were doing provisional supervision, then to add them to our insurance as we would a student? Okay, I'm not going to answer that question just because I actually don't know the answer. And what I would suggest is that if you are, because I also don't know if you're the provisional supervisor or if you're the one being provisionally supervised. I'm not quite sure. But even regardless of the answer to that, I would say consult your regulatory body and your insurance company because it may vary. I again don't know the answer, so I'm not going to answer that one. Okay, so there's also types of clinical supervision sessions. So you can do one-to-one clinical supervision sessions with a clinical supervisor. You can do dyadic, which is 2 to 1. So maybe it's someone you already know, or maybe there's somebody that the clinical supervisor knows that kind of wants dyadic clinical supervision with that supervisor. Or you can do group, which is a many-to-one clinical supervision with a clinical supervisor. Typically, and I'm going to say typically because I guess it varies person to person, province to province, but usually a clinical supervision group doesn't usually have more than 8 people. So when I say many to one, it's probably not going to be like 30, 40 people in that group, but it is usually more individuals. And you might be wondering, like, why would someone choose one over the other? And I guess there's kind of pros and cons depending on what it is that you're looking for. Was a pro to, well, there's a couple pros to the groups. I'll start with the group and I'll kind of make my way back up. So groups, the pros are you have a variety of different opinions and thoughts and experiences that, can help you problem solve. So I know the question about peer supervision kind of happened, uh, was asked earlier. And it's, I guess, kind of like peer supervision, except for you have like a known experienced supervisor to also provide their insights. But you have like other people's opinions, experiences. Also, what's really cool is that sometimes you might hear of a situation that didn't actually happen to you yet, and now you can problem solve it before it happens to you. So that's kind of pretty cool too. Dyadic is really cool, especially if you want, like maybe you have someone that you know personally and you're just like, let's kind of go in together. Maybe you're even a part of the same organization, or maybe you're partners in a practice or whatever. This can be really nice to be able to kind of talk through some of those issues. And one-to-one, of course, gives you that, direct supervision with the supervisor, right? So it's all about whatever the problems or needs that you have in your agency or your practice, and then you can kind of work through them. Typically, not always. It's usually cheaper per individual when it's either, well, a group is usually cheaper than dyadic and then individual. And it's because, individual is very much with one individual. So the fee would likely be higher. A dyadic, sometimes it's usually kind of cut down the middle. So one person pays one and one person pays the other. And then groups tend to, because there's more people, usually they charge less. And I say not always because fees aren't necessarily regulated, right? So you might find, different people charging different things. And, that's just a part of the private practice business side of things. But typically that's why, like that's some of the things to note. So kind of there's pros and cons to each one, but it's really deciding what works best for you and what you need in that moment. Okay, so if you're searching for external clinical supervisors, especially if you're thinking about going into private practice, you can check out clinical supervisor directories. And I'm actually the owner of two, well, one that's already up and one that's soon to be up. So in Canada, there's the Canadian Clinical Supervision Therapist Directory. Sorry if you hear my dog barking, which is at canadianclinicalsupervision.ca. And then the next one is in the US, which is coming soon. It's not up yet. So if you go to this website, you won't, it'll just say like coming soon. But it's going to be the American Clinical Supervisor Therapist Directory. So basically, you can find clinical supervisors in different provinces. The Canadian Clinical Supervision Therapist Directory is new. It only launched this year. So you might go on it and be like, maybe if you're in, say, Newfoundland, for example, we don't actually have any clinical supervisors in Newfoundland listed. Um, and you're like, oh, there's no one here. And it's because we're still kind of building up our clinical supervisor directory. but it is a really great place to start searching. And same with, individuals in the US. The American Clinical Supervisor Directory isn't up yet. It's hopefully going to be up in like the next month or so. But then, of course, then we have to find clinical supervisors for each state. So it is something to keep in your back pocket, especially if you're not going into private practice or you're not looking for an external supervisor right away. But this is something to note. Okay, so now we're going to kind of come back, and I'm going to go through this kind of quickly because this is information that's more legislative and regulative, or sorry, legislative and a part of regulation with respect to Alberta College of Social Workers and then the provinces. But I did want to touch on it because I think it's really important to know, especially in these provinces. Like I said, different provinces or different states may have different categories. But there are such things as restricted interventions. A restricted intervention is an intervention or treatment approach restricted to a specific profession, so social work, for example, or an authorized professional, so someone who's received a special authorization to provide a specific intervention. In Alberta, it's called a restricted psychosocial intervention. In Ontario, it's called the controlled active psychotherapy. So we'll start with Alberta. So I'm going to again use quotes because the best information comes from our regulatory bodies. Is the restricted psychosocial intervention or interventions are social work services performed to treat a substantial disorder to thought, mood, perception, or memory that grossly impairs judgment, behavior, the capacity to recognize reality, or the ability to meet the ordinary demands of life. This is a specialized and regulated area of social work practice only qualified and authorized social workers can perform these services. But there is a difference between a psychosocial intervention versus a restricted psychosocial intervention in Alberta. And in the next slide, we're actually going to be talking about kind of the definitions again that Alberta College of Social Workers has for both. Because sometimes people think that they can't provide services like counseling or even just intervention services at all as a social worker if they don't have the authorization from the college to provide the restricted psychosocial intervention. So, according to the Alberta College of Social Workers, a psychosocial intervention is a social work service focused on psychological, behavioral, and social factors. It aims to improve functioning and quality of life. The service is typically made up of screening, assessment, and intervention like supportive counseling, psychotherapy, referral services, and giving information and assistance. These services could be delivered to individuals, couples, families, and groups. So going back to the restricted psychosocial intervention, it's a social work service performed to treat grossly impaired mental health disorder. Now, this is their words, not mine. These interventions are performed with an expectation of treating a substantial disorder of thought, mood, perception, orientation, or memory that grossly impairs judgment, behavior, capacity to recognize reality, or the ability to meet ordinary demands of life. So if you can kind of see the difference is that restricted psychosocial intervention is for individuals who have significant impairment due to mental health disorder, whereas the unrestricted, we'll call it, psychosocial intervention, you can still provide services to individuals who don't necessarily fall within the definition of restricted psychosocial intervention. So I kind of going to repeat myself here, but in Alberta, social workers who want to provide restricted psychosocial intervention need individual authorization from the college to be under the supervision from someone who is authorized to provide such service. But social workers with the competency, and I use the word competency because again, that's Alberta College of Social Workers words, to do so are usually permitted to provide unrestricted psychosocial intervention. And I did see someone said that they want kind of an example of restricted interventions. So And again, I don't want to get too much into this because again, the best people to contact if you have any specific questions about the regulation is the college, right? Because I'm not speaking on behalf of the college for the college. They haven't approved what I'm saying here today. But um, it's not necessarily the intervention you're providing, it's the person you're providing it to. So do you mind actually going back a slide, Michelle, for a second? So if we look at kind of the term, and again, I'm going to go back to the, actually, I'll wait till Michelle gets, there we go. Where it says social work services performed to treat grossly impaired mental health disorder. So it's more about the person you're providing it to versus the intervention you're providing, if that makes sense. Because if you look at one, it's like you can still provide counseling, supportive counseling, psychotherapy, referral services, but it's focused more on psychological, behavioral, and social factors. Whereas restricted psychosocial is someone who, has significant impairments. And I can't give you an example like, if this person had this disorder, would that be categorized? This is where, clinical judgment, clinical kind of considerations. Obviously, if you have the authorization here in Alberta, which you can apply for, you do need clinical supervision and to apply for it. And we're going to talk about how you can apply for it in a second, or like who be qualified to get it. But at the end of the day, you can easily get the authorization. You just need some clinical supervision. And you can be supervised under someone who has the authorization. If you don't have the authorization, that's kind of how you get the hours towards your clinical, sorry, towards being authorized here in Alberta. Okay. And so, kind of like how to get it, or at least the qualifications, again, from the Alberta College of Social Workers website, is you do need a minimum of a bachelor's of social work, usually a master's of social work. But this, again, this is their exact words on their website. Registered on the general registry, so you can't be provisional at this point. Have the education training specific to assessment and treatment of, again, substantial mental health disorders that grossly impair, confirmation of supervised, safe and competent treatment of substantial mental health disorders that grossly impair, training, education, and supervised experience beyond academic course and practicum. So again, you would be required to have some supervision from someone authorized, and you do need to like I think they have to like submit like at the end of the hours that they feel that you're quote unquote competent to practice. Um, and then you obtain. But again, I could be corrected wrong on that. So again, follow up with your regulatory body if this applies to you. And so Ontario, the Controlled Active Psychotherapy. So it's a bit different here well, not here in Ontario, in Ontario. So what is considered the Controlled Active Psychotherapy in Ontario is to treat by means of psychotherapy technique delivered through a therapeutic relationship an individual's serious disorder of thought, cognition, mood, emotional regulation, perception, or memory that may seriously impair the individual's judgment, insight, behavior, communication, or social functioning. So that's the definition by the government of Ontario. So I want to go back to remember that letter I mentioned earlier with where insurance companies were kind of turning down claims for anyone who had a bachelor of social work providing psychotherapy services. So this is a quote directly from there. The Ontario College of Social Workers and Social Services Workers makes no distinction for registration between these educational qualifications. Registrants who do not have a master's of social work degree are allowed to practice the controlled act of psychotherapy. And again, I'm going to add in Ontario. So in Ontario, these are identified as the colleges who are permitted to provide the controlled act of psychotherapy in Ontario. There may be variations depending on, like, again, I don't know every college, like they may require permission or something like that. I'm just familiar with the Ontario College of Social Workers and Social Services Workers, but for the most part, these colleges can be or do have I guess, permission to provide the controlled act of psychotherapy in Ontario. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about becoming a private practice therapist. Because as I mentioned before, being a private practice therapist is a little bit different than just like being a therapist as an employee. And as we already mentioned, um, in Ontario, they actually request that you well, it's not an entry level position, right? So they kind of highlight that what that means. Again, it's important to connect with the Ontario College of Social Workers to double check on what that means. But for the most part, you can be a therapist, but it being a private practice therapist may not be an entry level position. So first of all, and I know you're probably all sick of me saying, but I really have to say it because every regulatory body is different. It's important to understand your regulatory body's guidelines regarding private practice because it can change at any time. It can also vary across provinces, across states, and I know we have people worldwide here today. Then it's also define what a private practice looks like for you. We often think about kind of like the therapy side of private practice, which is very, very common. But there are a variety of different kind of services or um, types of things that you can provide in private practice. Like it could be, again, whether you're permitted. This is, again, varies depending on regulations and kind of what's permitted, but like maybe assessments, or maybe you're providing information services, or maybe you're providing coaching. And we're going to talk about some what I call passive income streams in a little bit as well. So it's really defining like, what does that look like for me? Um, and then if it's a therapy practice, which is why you're all here today, so I know that's like the majority, ensure to have a theoretical orientation and accompanied by theoretical modalities that you work from. So like what type of theoretical orientation do you want to work from? And then, what therapeutic modalities do you want to learn within that theoretical orientation? For instance, I really consider myself kind of like a cognitive behavioral type therapist. Like I really focus on solution focused therapy, CBT, ACT. Those really align with who I am and kind of the services that I provide. So that is what, like, where I train and kind of how I present in my therapy sessions. Also, deciding on a niche, like a population to start with. You can always expand as you grow. Almost always, like as a business coach, I almost always see it that therapists and social workers think that they need to start with everybody. Like they have to, work with everyone that comes in. And actually, a lot of our regulatory bodies, they actually say we should be kind of have that experience, that knowledge to work with a specific population. So if we go into private practice and we're trying to work with everyone, it becomes really overwhelming. And if we haven't had that experience or knowledge in working with different populations, it could, impact our care. And I actually just think about when I first started in private practice, I did work with everyone in the very beginning. Really, it was just a month, but I did work with everyone in a month. And I realized that I was like chasing all of the therapeutic modalities, chasing worksheets. Like I had, I don't know, 20 clients, and all 20 of them had different needs and different requirements and different goals and different, like, it was just so chaotic. So I found that when I really just niche, so I went into working with workplace stress and burnout because that's what I love. And when I started working with that, I was able to really build my skills and not even we often feel imposter syndrome when we first start out, and I know I did. But then when I started really focusing on a specific population, I was able to feel more confident and comfortable because I was beginning to really get into the process and develop all the tools that I needed to work with a specific population. You can always expand as you grow, but I personally believe it's better to go small and then go out versus go out and then go in. And it's going to be a lot easier. Plus, I'm not going to get too much into marketing because we're not talking about marketing here today, but it is much easier to market a niched private practice than it is a generalist private practice. So yeah, I definitely recommend choosing a niche. Okay, so we're going to go really quickly through debunking private practice myths. So myth number one, you need 20%, or sorry, 20%, 20 plus years of experience. While some social work regulatory bodies state that private practice is not an entry-level position, and some even give guidance of at least 5 years social work experience, you do not need 20 plus years experience. Also, and I think this is where a lot of us, think, oh, if I get more experience, I'll learn more skill sets, is that therapy skills and business skills are very different skill sets. So the number of years that you're a therapist working doesn't correlate to how successful you'll be in business. So it's definitely important if you want to build kind of that confidence, that knowledge within opening a private practice, developing those business skills are just as important as the therapy skills because that's what's going to keep you successful into practice. Also, you need to ditch your full-time job. Absolutely not. Many private practitioners choose to start out in part-time basis before entering full-time private practice. In fact, there are so many social workers who choose to keep their full-time job and have a private practice on the side, providing services on evenings and weekends. And I also want to also highlight, if you're someone who's been in the field, maybe working, I always say health center just because it's like where a lot of social workers end up being, but in a health center and you want to provide external clinical supervision to someone, that can still be considered a private practice. Maybe you're not working directly with clients specifically, but you're supporting fellow practitioners help build their skills and kind of navigate some ethical dilemmas that might come up, um, which is then in turn helping their clients as well. So I want to go back to when I said, kind of identifying what private practice looks like for you or what that looks like. It might be a clinical supervision practice, and it might not even be a therapy practice. Okay, insurance companies do not cover social workers. While many insurance providers in Canada do cover, so sorry, many insurance providers in Canada do cover services provided by RSWs. However, coverage does vary by provider and by plan. There are some plans that just don't cover mental health coverage at all. Like it's just not a part of the plan that the employer or whoever, kind of registered within that plan is getting. While others do cover specific designations such as psychologists or social workers in with MSW. And again, going back to that letter from the Ontario College of Social Workers, that was presented to insurances because people with a BSW were getting denied, or not, they weren't getting denied, their clients were getting denied from coverage. So that was kind of like an advocacy piece to get covered. But even when, like in private practice, like I've had individuals who I would meet with, and they were like, "Oh, only psychologists are covered under my insurance." Well, obviously, doesn't matter if I have an MSW or not. I wasn't going to be covered, so they had to make a decision whether they wanted to pay my full rate or find a psychologist that could cover. And also, insurance companies typically do not cover, sorry, they do cover counseling and therapy services only, but they don't cover coaching, consulting, supervision, so forth. Myth number four, you can only offer one-to-one therapy services in private practice. Absolutely not. Social workers in private practice can diversify their services in a variety of ways. Even if you don't even want to provide one-to-one services, you can provide other types of services. So workshops, trainings, group therapy, consulting, supervision, selling digital templates, blogging, podcasting, writing a book. In fact, diversifying income can actually help with the financial impact of ebbs and flows of therapy service provision. So, many therapists see the certain times of year, depending on what their niche is, or I just know for me, August and December every year, total write-off. So I take vacation during that time, between December 15th to January 15th. And it's because people are like in holiday season. In the summer, people are always, traveling, doing things with their family. So my particular practice was always, I don't say always slow, but like it was more slower than other times of years. So having additional income streams can really help with that impact. In fact, I actually wrote a book. It's not out yet. It's coming out in the winter of 2026, but it's called The Passive Practice. It's the passive income roadmap for maximizing schedule flexibility, time freedom, and private practice profitability. So it really focuses on how to identify different passive income streams that you can incorporate into your existing therapy practice, or even if you don't want to create a therapy practice, maybe you want to stay into your full-time job, but want to incorporate different passive income streams. Right now, I think it's 9 passive income streams. And when the ones that I'm working on are out, I'll have actually 15 passive income streams. So I personally really believe that passive income is really helpful. And I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of questions on what that means. And of course, that's beyond the scope of this webinar. If you definitely want to connect with me after the fact, we can chat about that. But you know, whether you want to do one-to-one services or not, incorporating alternate income streams can be super helpful.
Yeah, and if I can bounce off that, I saw someone in the chat ask, how can I develop my business skills as a private practice therapist? And I would say connecting with Kayla is a great first start. She brings a wealth of knowledge that, we can't get into today, but she has a great podcast, resources, and you can connect with her one-on-one too to get that support.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Okay, myth number 5. You have to do it all alone. Absolutely not. There are social media communities. I actually run one. I know I've seen Aaron, one of my students, put the group in the chat. There's supervision groups. There's business coaching. Like myself, I provide business coaching services. There's networks of other therapists and practice owners designed for guidance. You could also partner with like a friend or a colleague who obviously is a therapist themselves, and you can partner in starting a private practice. You could also hire in your practice, whether it's students, employees, independent contractors. You don't always have to do it alone, right? There's a variety of people that you can connect with to help with whatever support you need. Okay, and that is all of the presentation. We are going to do some Q&As. So we are going to be mindful of time. We're going to answer some questions, but we're definitely not going to go over 12 o'clock. And I do want to be mindful of that, okay?
Awesome. So thank you so much, Kayla, for all this helpful information. For those of you who can't stick around for the Q&A, thank you for attending. And for those of you, I saw there's lots of questions in the chat. So I think we're both looking forward to answering your questions. And if you have any questions, be sure to ask them in the chat and we'll try our best to answer as many as we can before the top of the hour.
Okay. So, do some jobs require a clinical MSW? Michelle, do you know that one?
Yeah, so like I said, an MSW is an MSW. So you don't necessarily need to have like a clinically focused MSW degree to get into a clinical social work role. Now, depending on where you are, there are some differences with licensing. So in Ontario, for example, we don't necessarily differentiate between different types of social workers, but I know in the US, they have some differences between the types of licensing that they have. They have like licenses that are particular to people who are clinical social workers and then like regular social workers. So as far as education goes, no, but licensing maybe depending on where you are.
So the next one I'll answer, and I'm not sure what this is referring to, but can I do this with a social work diploma if I am registered? And again, you're going to hear me say it depends on which province, because of course I'm not sure which province that you're in with respect to, and I also don't know what this is. So I don't know if that is, providing therapy, going into private practice. Um, but it again, it varies depending on your province. So I'll go back to the example of Ontario. Again, using that exact quote that was up there earlier, it actually said that that the Ontario College of Social Workers and Social Services Workers don't make any distinction between its members. So if you take that, the answer is yeah, if you're providing therapy. Um, Here in Alberta, um, I don't know specifically about a social work diploma as therapy as in general, but if we think about the definition of what qualifies someone of having restricted psychosocial authorization, the criteria was a minimum of a bachelor's for that particular. So again, I don't have all of the specifics because I don't work at the Alberta College of Social Workers or any regulatory body, and this is why I really do encourage each and every one of you. If some of what we said here today kind of piqued your interest, oh, does this apply to me? Does this apply to me? Connect with your regulatory body. They are the best people to consult. Also, review your standards of practice. Review if they have private practice guidelines. Um, they are the people that create this like kind of regulation. So they're the best people to ask in your specific situation. Um, Someone said, as registration is not required in Yukon, can I provide virtual therapy there even though I'm registered in Alberta and Ontario? Would I say that I am registered licensed in Yukon if I provide service there? So good question. Actually, during the pandemic, I got lots of friends who provided services in the Yukon during the pandemic because it's not regulated at all. With the respect to a registered license criteria, that's a good question. I mean, you don't necessarily want to mislead the public because even though it's because you're not technically registered in the Yukon. So I'm not going to really answer that because I don't know the answer, but yeah, like I know a lot of people here in Alberta that provided virtual services to the Yukon. The other thing I'm going to say, and this is kind of like the marketing side, is also recognize that if everyone can provide services in the Yukon, a lot of people are advertising in the Yukon, and there's compared to the amount of social workers, there's not a lot of therapists, or sorry, not a lot of population in the Yukon. So we also need to verify, like you can definitely show up there and provide services there. As of right now, remember I did say that they are looking towards getting regulation. Once that happens, you will have to get registered. So if you have any clients, you'll have to get registered once regulation happens. So or just work with that client anymore. Like I don't know how that works, but the point is just know that it is coming. Like they are looking at it. But yes, like I've had lots of colleagues do it. It's just hard because now you have to advertise in another province with a lot of people. I assume a lot of people are still now advertised. I know during the pandemic, everyone decided to practice there. So they had like thousands of practitioners. But again, it's the population versus the practitioner. Anyway, I hope that answers that question. I think I answered this, so I'm gonna I'll mention it. So, but I'll is regular supervision mandatory? And I did answer that. It depends, like depending on what your regulatory body is, depends on what part you are. But I truly believe ongoing consultation, regardless of whether you are quote unquote required for supervision, is absolutely one of the best skill builders you can have. And actually, one thing I forgot to mention, many regulatory bodies actually allow clinical supervision to be considered as your CECs each year. So again, you have to check with your regulatory body, but many will count that as just as equivalent to training. And it's because it really does create the stuff you learn in your training is now implemented into practice. So it's like I honestly think that one without the other doesn't really mesh. This would be for you, Michelle. So, do MSW admission departments have a bias against people who have a goal to be a therapist, in contrast to working as a quote unquote social worker?
Yeah, so this is a really good question, and this is something we navigate a lot with our personal statement editing service. I do find that a lot of people choose to pursue a Master of Social Work as a means of becoming a therapist. And I don't think that that's an inherently bad thing. Um, but you want to be very clear about why you are choosing a degree in social work over another like field or way of getting there. So you want to make sure that you are showing that you are philosophically aligned with social work programs. So as an example, like someone might be choosing to practice, like become like pursuing a master of social work to become a therapist because of social work's focus on social justice. I often see a lot of people who come from, like, for example, the field of psychology, and they were on a track to maybe pursue a doctorate in psychology. But in their undergrad, they realized that, you know, the field of psychology is maybe a bit too focused on the individual and what's wrong with them and their pathology. But my perspective is more holistic, and I want to look at the big picture and the social systems that influence people's mental health and the things that they're going through. And that's part of why I want to become like a clinical social worker, is to kind of like bridge those two pieces. So I think it's totally fine to say that you are interested in clinical practice. You just want to be very clear about like how you align philosophically with social work. And that's where I think that conversation comes back to, is social work truly the right pathway for you? There's lots of pathways that can take you to your goal of becoming a therapist. So if you're not philosophically aligned with social work, there might be another path that's open to you that might actually get you to your goal sooner, because you're going to get the training and the clinical experience sooner than you would with a social work degree. And then I see another one here that I can probably answer as well. Does this apply to the MSW thesis programs as well, in regards to internships? So this is probably talking about when I was talking about leveraging your internship to get experience. I think you definitely could utilize your MSW thesis to like enhance your education and like gain experience, maybe not in a direct way, but like developing your knowledge, right? So maybe your MSW thesis will have something to do with mental health or therapeutic modalities or something like that. I'm not too sure, because I'm not too sure like how that would actually pan out, because you're not technically getting experience. But I mean, I think there's probably ways that you could be creative with that.
The question, so this is like kind of starting off a business. Do I have to register as a business if I'm just starting off, or can I just use my name? If I am providing services in different provinces, do I have to register as a business in each of these provinces? So this is kind of a big question, but really I'm going to kind of direct you in the right place. Of course, if you want to connect with me, and book a consult or receive business coaching from me, please connect with me. However, each again province, and it's usually by the like government. So like here, it's the government of Alberta. In Ontario, it's government of Ontario, so forth. They have their steps for business registration. Certain provinces will say that if you're just using your name, you do not have to register as a business. Now, when I say using your name, that would be like Kayla Das. If I said Kayla Das Counselling, that's now a business name. Or here in Alberta, they call it a trade name. So it's technically as a sole proprietor, but it's called trade name. So trade name, sole proprietorship is kind of what you're considering there. There's also different levels like corporation, things like that. I'm not going to get into that in this webinar. But like you can just Google, business name, insert your province or state here, and kind of see what it is that is required, and what you can do. I guess the second part of the question is, if I'm providing services in different provinces, do I have to register as a business in each of these provinces? Again, it depends on the requirements in that particular province. And yeah, so I'll just leave it there. So because again, it's hard to give, like, I don't want to give advice on individual circumstances when everyone's individual circumstance is different, right? So this is more for informational services or informational purposes than giving direct advice, because it's just so hard. You can't possibly give advice on 100 different potential circumstances. Aside from Psychology Today, are you aware of any other places to get notice of market? Absolutely, and I'm going to talk about passive and active marketing strategies. A lot of private practitioners will start out thinking, oh, if I go on Psychology Today and I build a website, I'm going to immediately be found, like build it and they will come kind of thing. Um, So there's different, so active marketing strategies are strategies that you employ that directly require you to be active in that specific area. Like, creating workshops like we're doing today. Like, kind of side note, this was a part of our own marketing, right? So we wanted you to kind of know who we were, learn about us, all of that. Obviously, you've seen that my students have been sharing different links. I mean, that's all like, again, for us to be active, right? We're active marketing right now. Therapist directories are what's called passive marketing, basically meaning you kind of create it. Now you should optimize it and update it. And again, I even got a course, an online course about how to write and optimize a Psychology Today profile. So really, all that can go into its own little rabbit hole. But like, passive marketing strategies tend to convert less than active marketing strategies. And when I say convert, that might be a new word, but convert just means basically like getting clients less because it hasn't built the know, like, and trust factor with someone. So they don't know you yet. They don't like you. They don't not like you, but like they haven't built that like for you yet, and they haven't built that trust with you yet. So when you think of going on Psychology Today or any other therapist directory, there's so many therapists to choose from, and there's a lot of optimization strategies you can implement to get found. But typically, a conversion rate for therapist directories is between about 3 and like sometimes at the very, very high end, 15%. So, people think that they could just have a Psychology Today and sometimes not even with a website, and then that they'll fill their practice, and that's not the case. And actually, more times than not, clients looking at Psychology Today want to see a website on top so that they can attached so that they can learn more about you. And I'm actually one of those clients. Before I went into private practice, I was looking for a therapist on Psychology Today, and any therapist that didn't have a website, I just went on and found one that did. And it's because it kind of is like your virtual, um, it's like your virtual like office, if that makes sense. Like it shows that you're legitimate, not that you're not legitimate, but it just kind of gives that feel to a prospective client. So really it's about you can maximize passive marketing strategies, but active marketing strategies are also important. So building referral relationships, connecting, with others. You can be on Psychology Today and other therapist directories, but it's also important to also know is that therapist directory that you're registering for, is that showing up in search engines? I always tell people in your province, in your right after this, I want to give you all homework to Google therapist near me and see what pops up. If you're on a therapist directory that isn't coming up at least on the first 2 pages of Google, you're probably not going to get a lot of clients from it unless that particular organization does a lot of external marketing, right? And it's because people are going on Google looking stuff up, and spoiler alert, Psychology Today is almost always first. But there's a lot of other therapist directories that a lot of people will register for, and they get no referrals. And it's because they're not visible. Like people can't find them. So I encourage you to look that up for yourself.
For sure. And if I can kind of bounce off that too a little bit, I think there's kind of more competition than ever, especially post-COVID, where a lot of therapists are practicing online. So people are not really limited by geographical borders, aside from, registration requirements and stuff. But if somebody lives in Toronto, they could have a therapist that lives in London because they can provide those services online. And I think that really speaks to what Kayla was talking about earlier about niching down and the power of that. And, instead of being that person that is the 150th person available who can provide general therapy services, it's like, how can you get more specific about helping people with specific problems? And speaking from myself, as I'm not in private practice, but a lot of you would have found me not because I provide graduate school help, but because I provide help with social work applications specifically, right? That's what makes me stand out compared to other services that might exist. So I think that is really a powerful thing, and it allows you to find ways to show how you're different and like the ways that you can help people in different ways.
Yeah, and I actually want to comment, and there's someone in the chat said something, and I definitely want to clarify if I misinterpret. I don't know if this was to another comment or not. But Sherry commented and said you cannot provide services to individuals located in different provinces if you aren't registered with that province. Absolutely. You need to be registered in that province or state with the regulatory body in that state or province. If that was in relation to what I was saying, I meant with a business structure. So the question was, if I am providing services in different provinces, do I have to register as a business in each of these provinces? And again, the answer is still the same. It's you need to make sure that you know what the requirements are in that particular province. But so that's register your business versus register as a social worker. So they're two different registries. So I want to clarify that just because you're registered as a social worker in a specific um, province doesn't mean you're automatically registered as a business. So that's where I talk about the therapy side and the business side. They don't always correlate, right? And sometimes it can be confusing. So I did want to clarify that. So thank you, Sherry, for commenting that in the chat because that is definitely an important distinction that I did not want people walking away with. So I appreciate that. Okay, we'll do one more question. Well, maybe we'll do two. I want to answer one here because I see it all the time. Can business consult sessions be covered by insurance? And absolutely not. And that's actually what I kind of mentioned before in when we talked about mostly insurances will only cover therapy and mental health services. Sometimes it even just specifies psychotherapy. Like it depends on the individual's plan. But clinical consultation, clinical supervision, coaching, business consulting, all of that is not considered mental health services or psychotherapy. So they are not covered. But we'll do another one because I just wanted to clarify that because I get it almost every time I have a consult. Somebody asks me that question, so I just wanted to highlight that one. But another question, um, uh, okay, maybe I'll do two more. One is I was under the impression about starting a private practice wasn't cost effective due to insurance. Is this the case? I guess it depends on what type of insurance you're talking about. If you're talking about malpractice insurance, I pay I don't know, like $300-400 a year. I mean, that's not a lot. So that's my malpractice insurance connected with that. So a lot of associations or colleges will have discounts that you can get if you're a part of a regulatory body. You can get malpractice insurance. So malpractice insurance really isn't that expensive, especially if you have access to those special discount codes. If you're talking about insurance as like health insurance, like somebody kind of direct billing or like a client coming in and saying, "Hey, do you provide direct services with my insurance company?" Um, I still don't know if this is answering the question, but when it comes to direct billing, you as a private practitioner have a choice on whether you want to direct bill, meaning you kind of set up with each individual health provider, or TELUS e-claims, which is a direct billing provider that kind of like encapsulates multiple different insurance companies here in Canada. And you just direct bill you every time a client comes sees you, you direct bill the insurance company. However, I never used to do that because that seemed like a lot of administrative work. I just was not into that. I never direct billed. I always gave a receipt to a client, but I did encourage them I would say, please note that not every insurance provider covers my services. I recommend that you check your insurance provider to ensure that well, I'm an MSW, so MSW, RSWs are covered under your plan. Because, like I said earlier, sometimes it's even just psychologists covered. And I had people that, only had psychologists covered. So they had to make a choice on whether they wanted to see me or if they wanted to go and find a psychologist. So I would give them a receipt and then they would submit to their insurance. Now, our US friends that are here, your direct billing insurance company, process is way different than the US. I have no idea, like I know that it exists and I hear everyone talk about it. I cannot give any advice on the US side of it because here in Canada, I will say it's quite easy. It seems, at least from someone who doesn't do it in the US, it seems quite complex. So if you're looking for insurance related advice, I would definitely recommend connecting with someone in the US who has that knowledge. Now, the final question is how can we get more information on passive income streams like Kayla mentioned? I know the book is out next year, but are there other resources available in the meantime? Absolutely. So I actually have a podcast, as I mentioned. Lots of it talks about different concepts, specifically passive income. Really, my like I loved like talking about scaling private practices. While building private practices are definitely my jam as well. I built my coaching career really on kind of passive income streams. So I definitely recommend checking in to the podcast. You can also check me out. I have a blog as well. And if you want to like specifically connect with me, you can check out my website and you can book a consult. I probably didn't actually update all of my availability for November, so maybe wait an hour and then I'll double check and update some of my availability. But definitely you can book some like a consult with me and we can kind of talk about that and if you want to work towards that. But that is really my jam. Passive income is all what I'm about. So,
Awesome. And if you're applying to MSW programs, you can actually go to Kayla's podcast and listen to our episode that just came out a few weeks ago. So if you kind of want to hear us talk more, then that's there as well. Well, thank you so much, Kayla, for joining us. I learned a ton, and I'm sure everyone else did as well. And I'm so glad that they know how to find you if they have more questions about the business side of things or anything else. Um, I saw a question about whether the recording will be sent out. Please keep your eyes out for an email from me probably later today. I'll send out the recording as well as an invitation to book a conversation with me if you are deciding between different programs and kind of want to figure out a game plan for your career goals and like what is the best strategy for you. So yeah, thank you guys so much. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and thanks again.
thanks everyone.